They must be out there somewhere.
It's Chris Kniesler,
What a wonderful
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Rosa and I'm honored to say that I am the president of the New Jersey Tea Party Caucus. And on behalf of the New Jersey Tea Party Caucus and our sponsors, Smart Girl Politics and New Jersey Tea Parties United, I would like to welcome all of you to this very unique event where we will begin to ask the tough questions about education.
Infamous, but I started this trek by doing a documentary film called The Cartel about corruption in public education. I used New Jersey as a case study for that. I can't tell you how many times I get the same comment, which is that someone emails me from Iowa, like from last week, and say, we have it really bad here. It's just all the same issues. Not as bad as New Jersey, but it's all the same issues we have here in Iowa. It's not that bad, but it's really bad. So anyway, I thought by calling the film The Cartel, I would dispel any notion that I was hiding any possible political orientation or point of view when some documentarians are consider that form of art to supposedly be fly on the wall and without any advocacy position. And so I thought that the name Cartel would get us past that. So I did the film. It turns out it basically just took off. We ended up winning 12 Film Festival Awards, a national theatrical release in 2010, distribution from Warner Brothers, which is for an independent film practically a miracle. If you go to a film festival, you can see how many films are produced, and so it's rare to get distribution, and we were grateful for that. Which then led me to the next step. People around the country and everywhere were asking me, you know, what's your next film going to be? Assuming a typical documentary model where I'd move to another topic, I'd go do the drug war next or immigration next. But there was no subject that really called to me the way education did. So my next phase is to create Choice Media, which is an education reform news service homepage, as we call it. Everything from opinion columns, this is updated every day, opinion columns on the right, news stories on the left, original video documentary pieces on the website all the time. And that's basically my day job now, is producing Choice Media TV and also going around and advocating for education reform.
I knew that was going to come out.
Anyway, the school choice is something that I've been involved with for a long time, since I was with School Boards Association. I've looked at a number of programs around the country and seen the success, and I've also witnessed firsthand the resistance that we get by our representatives in the state legislature to any type of initiative. And I brought a prop with me, and this will spell out really the biggest problem that we have in New Jersey, and it dovetails very much with the cartel. What I have here are the ELEC reports from the NJEA PAC for this past election cycle. And there are almost $700,000 spent on campaigns. Of that, one Republican received a donation. One. And he was in his very safe district, and he was new, and they're probably trying to document him. But that's where our problem lies. We have no shortage of ideas in this state. I mean, the Alliance for Children gave our governor an A rating for what he's trying to do in the area of education. The problem is the legislature is doing everything they can to stop him, and because many legislators fear the NJEA more than they fear their own constituents, and that's just an added battle that we have to overcome. But that doesn't mean we can't do it.
A real quick story. When the bill was up for discussion, there was a fairly lengthy conversation going on about teachers who perhaps wanted to participate in a charter school environment and with regard to tenure. And the representative from the NJEA was arguing about how long they should be allowed to maintain their status in the school that they left, should they go to a charter school. And ordinarily it would be 3 years. Well, the discussion proceeded for approximately 45 minutes, At which point I broke protocol and asked the chairman, Senator Patel, I said, Senator, may I ask a question? And he said, by all means. And Dee Carano, who at the time was the principal lobbyist for the NJEA, I said, Dee, I said, just a quick question. I said, when a person has tenure in a public school system, you know, what happens when they leave the public school system and they go to a new public school system? What happens to their tenure? And she said, well, they start all over again and they lose tenure entirely. That was the end of the discussion. Because the fact of the matter is they're trying to provide something to protect their individuals in one setting, which is totally contradictory to the other setting. And again, these are the kinds of things that the public generally is not aware of. That's number one. The second problem is, or probably the single biggest problem in New Jersey, and Bob, I don't know if it's the same way nationwide, we have got to get the courts out of education. They have no business being there. They screw it up more than you could ever possibly imagine. In fact, at one point in time, there was a decision that was rendered by the New Jersey Supreme Court, and the opening statement in the decision was, and I'm quoting, "the Constitution notwithstanding." There's your problem. They don't care about the Constitution. They don't really care about what it says. They don't care about the kids. So that's another issue. The third problem is, as far as funding education, we keep hearing about a thorough and efficient education. If you read the Constitution of the state of New Jersey, it does not say a thorough and efficient education. It says a thorough and efficient system of education, which is an enormous difference. The problem is that we fund everything. For example, if you have a school in Bowdon County that has a brand new swimming pool that costs $250,000, according to the way the Supreme Court operates, you are now required to give or spend that additional $250,000 to each of 31 school districts across the entire state so that they can then be brought up to the same spending level, not the same educational level. So for some reason, our Supreme Court wants to equate an equality of spending with the equality of education. That is not now, nor will it ever be, what the problem is in terms of education. There are a whole lot of issues that we will get involved in as we go through, but again, if I could start all over tomorrow, the first thing I would do is have a constitutional amendment that prohibits the NJEA and the New Jersey Supreme Court from having any interference or input whatsoever as it relates to education in the state of New Jersey.
I am a product of the public school system. I am born and raised in Brooklyn, and I have been teaching in New York City for the past 18 years. Well, I hesitate to say that because then I date myself. But in any case, it's been quite a ride as I've evolved from a ignorant, just want to change the world, kind of come in and be a role model, Latina role model to my students, to one where I am now immersed in the Teacher Union Alliance and their obstacle towards school reform. And if you think that the unions are your friends when it comes to reform, you are mistaken. The other day I was perusing the newspaper and I came up with this little tidbit. This is my little exhibit A. Lessons in lobbying. The UFT devotes $3.8 million to politics after 44% hike. That tells you that my payment, my co-payment, my UFT dues are not being used for the things that I think should be used, but rather they're being used to influence and sway political people in the fold to get favors. That's the reason that we have not advanced with our school reform in the past, I don't know, 30 plus years. You start speaking about Union Alliance and you become really as a UFT person in New York City, and then you come over to New Jersey, and things just start to get a whole lot clearer. When you walk into a suburban school and you notice that your child does not have the laptops And the smart boards that kids in Newark or Camden have, though they are getting our tax base where I live, I'm paying about $12,000 plus. All our monies are being drained and going into the Abbott School District and surrounding districts, Newark, Patterson, Camden, Irvington, and I am all for school reform and all for these children having what they need in order to succeed, but not at the expense of my dollar and having my child shortchanged and having only one laptop in her school floating around while everyone else at $29,000 in Newark goes on and on. It's just pervasive, and one more tidbit, if you think the unions are all for performance-based evaluations and performance-based growth, you are mistaken. They are opposing any kind of growth in this area in terms of having evaluations tied into merit. So there's just, we can go on and on. Just a little, I'm not upset. I'm just letting you know what's going on. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Dr. Moore and I are very pleased to be here from Michigan. Thank you for the weather, making us feel at home.
You're welcome.
Hillsdale College's work in K-12 education reform centers on a charter school initiative. Through it, we find parents and citizens across the country who seek to found classical charter schools, and we support them primarily on the design and implementation of their academic program. We focus exclusively on classical schools. In this kind of education, the student carefully studies the liberal arts. It has been the educational tradition in the West for 2.5 millennia. We have learned from the ancients and the great thinkers in our heritage what kind of education must be provided to a free and self-governing people in a republic so that they can flourish and the republic can survive. Make no mistake, a proper understanding of the liberal arts includes the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. But distinguishing this academic focus, however, is a rigor and an accompanying school culture, educational philosophy, and aim that are simply not sufficiently present in other schools today. The school culture is one of discipline, decorum, and studiousness, accompanied by a demand for moral virtue among the students. The educational philosophy reflects what our Western forebears knew, that objective standards of truth and beauty exist, and we must learn what they are and conform ourselves to the highest and timeless principles if we are to know and enjoy our unalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our country's founders knew this, so we also make a rigorous study of them, what they did and what they knew. So our aim, therefore, is to educate the young so they may rise to be wise and virtuous American citizens.
Hello, thank you for having us out here. I wanted to add to some of the things Mr. Kilgore was saying. But the first thing I want to do is to dispel a myth that I think many people have when they talk about education in this country. Even if you read the pages of the Wall Street Journal, you're led to believe that the only places that education is failing is in what we euphemistically call the inner city or urban districts. That's not true. The public schools are failing everywhere. Even in some of the richest and most conservative places in the country, even in places like Colorado Springs. And my thesis is, and I'm not including charter schools in this, but there is no such thing as a good public school out there. And to the extent that there are programs that are better than others, usually what they're better at doing is making your students not very knowledgeable of the Constitution, not like their country very much, perhaps not even like their families very much, and they're certainly not going to try to do anything that would uphold rather than to take away from a person's individual religion. In other words, the schools, to the extent that they are good, are probably very left-leaning, and there's a kind of propaganda that goes hand in hand with that. At any rate, and of course nobody is talking about what's going on in the rural communities of this town, of this country. And so that's just something that goes under the radar that no one wants to talk about. But I will tell you, having been to several small towns and living in a small town myself, there are plenty of people who are dissatisfied with that education as well. Why is that? Well, this would take a fairly long time to tell you the whole history of what's called progressive education in this country, which goes all the way back to probably around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century. But if you want to read it in a very short capsule, the best thing that you can do is take out your copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, which you probably were assigned in school, and you probably think you've read, and take a look at chapter 2 and read the whole thing. And then read about the first couple of paragraphs of chapter 4. And you will find in a very succinct way a description of the decline of public schools in this country and how it happened. And it's not explained why it was never stopped. I get that question a lot. Why didn't anybody do anything about it? It's because nobody opposed what was going on in the schools, starting in as early as the 30s and 40s, but certainly in the 60s and 70s. And so sometimes older people will say, well, I had a pretty good public school education. And that's right, you probably did. But between your education and my education, and then what would be my children's education in public schools, things have declined dramatically. And there are 3 basic reasons for that. The first is that there is no curriculum. You may think that your students in the high school, they have a curriculum of some sort. There is no curriculum. There are a set of standards, and you're told that they're supposed to apply this learning standard or that learning standard. But if you were to go to the curriculum director of a particular school and say, what books are your students reading? That person couldn't tell you. If you were to ask that person, what's in those books? That person couldn't tell you, because there is no curriculum. If you don't believe that, you should become acquainted with the works of E.D. Hirsch, who has exposed this situation for the last 20 or 30 years. The second reason your students aren't learning anything, or students in public schools aren't learning anything, is because the teachers are not very good. Now, that's not to say that no teacher is any good. And usually anybody who goes through a public school has an experience of saying, well, there was that one teacher and he was really hard, but everybody else was not very hard. That's the typical experience. The reason those teachers are not very good is because they have to go through a process. It's called certification, and so they have to come out of the nation's education schools. What goes on in the nation's education schools is not education. It's a bunch of puffery that's masking as education, and it's also learning how to beat the system, how to be a union member, how to be an advocate for the schools, and how to sympathize with children and figure out the 9 million ways they can't learn rather than the 2 or 3 ways they can learn. And I will tell you that the #1 issue right now in public education, and this is something that your state senators and assemblymen need to hear, is teacher certification. In New Jersey, even if you were to start a charter school, you could not hire uncertified teachers. That means even when you're trying to break away from the public school system, you will still have to hire the same type of teachers. There is no school of education in this country that requires its future teachers to learn how to teach reading through phonics. Well, there's one exception, Hillsdale College. There is no school of education in this country that teaches its teachers how to teach grammar through traditional means of diagramming. There's no school of education in this country that makes its teachers learn the Constitution, or makes its teachers take a course on Shakespeare if they're going to be teaching English. Therefore, the teachers who go into the schools do not know anything. Now, the third reason, in addition to there not being very good teachers, and then also there being no curriculum, is basically school politics and the machine that is the bureaucracy. But since you probably know that and so many other people talk to those issues on this panel, I'll go ahead and let that pass. But I will tell you that school reform will only work insofar as we make the curriculum foremost, and also insofar as we make it the #1 agenda to get the right kind of teachers into a school. I'll leave just with one anecdote. I've hired a lot of teachers, and I've not hired a lot of teachers in running a school. One time I got this call from somebody who supposedly had a master's degree in literacy from a local college and had 7 years of teaching experience. And sometimes these people, when they want jobs, they're pretty pushy. And of course, I was not going to look at this person because I was looking for a very different kind of candidate. But at any rate, this person called me on the phone and said, hey, you know, I have 7 years of teaching experience and I have a master's degree in literacy. I think I'd be a great teacher for your school. And I said, great. Well, let me ask you a question. How do you teach reading if you have a master's degree in literacy? She said, oh, well, you know, I use a combination of approaches, some phonics, some, you know, whole language, a blended approach. I said, okay, very well. So you know at least some phonics? She said, yes. I said, tell me the sounds that the letter A makes. I got silence on the end of the phone. And then after a long pause, I heard, I guess long A and short A. And I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, but my kindergartners can tell me that the letter A makes at least 4 sounds: a, ah, and aw. For example, the word father, we don't pronounce it father, we don't pronounce it fatter. Now, if a master's degree in literacy does not have the understanding of just the letter A, how is this person going to teach your children how to read? I guarantee you that woman did get a job, and she's teaching somebody's children right now, or that is failing to teach them.
I want to talk from a little different perspective. My perspective is political activism. In 1992, I was living in California, and the concept of school vouchers and school choice first made its way into the national scene. Now, back then, people had no idea what a voucher was. I mean, it was just a foreign language. And there were a lot of advocacy on both sides of the issue. And I remember one morning listening to NPR radio, and they said, you know, this school choice initiative coming up could be very dangerous for democracy. And I'm thinking, well, why? They said, it could allow pagan schools. And I said, oh, you gotta be kidding me. This is what we have right now. So I practically threw the radio out the window. I've never listened to NPR since then, and I never will. And I got on the phone and I called Sacramento and I said, who's sponsoring the school choice initiative? They said, Excellence in Choice Through Education League. I said, give me their phone number. I called them up and I said, what can I do to help? They said, well, we'll have you make some phone calls and call up voters. Well, after about a week of that, I said, listen, I can do better than this. I want to get up in front of people. I want to talk about this. I want to debate people. And that's what I did. I didn't have any background in education. I didn't have any background in politics or anything like that. But I'd had enough. I'd heard enough lies, enough crap, and I said, I'm going to do something. It reminded me of, do you ever see Taxi Driver? Travis Bickle? He said, here was a guy who would not take it anymore. That's what I felt like. So I went out and with my wife Julie there, we went to various colleges, schools, civic organizations, and I debated people from the California Teachers Association. And what a wake-up call that was. I mean, you talk about a thugocracy, that's how I'm going to describe it. The California Teachers Association raised, in today's dollars, $48 million to defeat a school choice initiative. Now, this is in spite of the fact that many, many teachers and educational professionals are very much in favor of school choice. You know, you have to remember, with the failing school system we have now, there's 2 losers. There's 2 assets that are being wasted. We're wasting the lives of children. We're also wasting the professional careers of teachers. How many teachers have you heard about that have given up after a certain amount of time and gone into investment banking or whatever, sales? How many other teachers can't take the bureaucratic oversight and the limited viewpoints of the education system, and they just kind of settle into a mediocre profession? It's very difficult. So that's my perspective. That's where I come from on this issue, and I want to continue in the political aspect of it by talking about the fact that there's nothing in our Constitution, either New Jersey or the U.S. Constitution, that says we have to send our children to government schools. No one should use the term public schools anymore. It's a misnomer. It's not what they are. They are government schools. Now, when you start thinking that way, it changes your perspective. You start thinking, oh, government, Department of Motor Vehicles, Post Office, okay, not the military. They get the job done for very little pay, and they die and bleed for it. But think about it. Government schools, that's where our children are. And they're no longer about education. They're about social indoctrination. They're about creating a compliant class of workers, and I don't want to use some other words that are offensive, but that's really what our school system has become. Thank you.
American education is in deep trouble. Along a springboard to opportunity has now become a dragging anchor that threatens our future. We must understand that public education is an entitlement, though historically we haven't thought of it that way. Furthermore, in terms of its size, scope, and metastasizing cost, it is both larger and more dangerous than the more frequently discussed entitlements of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Left unchecked on its current trajectory, American education will be cited by future historians as a central cause in the decline of American civilization. This thesis rests on three incontestable realities concerning which America has been in denial for decades. One, low performance of U.S. schools, too well known to argue about. Two, high costs of U.S. schools. All studies show U.S. at or near the top in spending. Three, abundant models of higher performance coupled with lower costs to be found in our country and across the world. If we to solve our problems, we must first understand what went wrong. Here are some of the questions that we need to answer. Why, between 1970 and 2008, when K-12 student population increased only 8%, did the number of teachers increase by 61% and total staff by 93%? What between 1970 and 2010 caused inflation-adjusted K-12 spending to increase by 102%? How, when we already spend 3 of every 5 state and local dollars on education, can the education establishment claim to be grossly underfunded? Why do educators have pension and health benefits twice that of the average citizen? How do other, once elitist, industrial nations now educate a higher proportion of 5 to 18-year-olds than the United States, and more successfully? How do Japan and some European nations do a better job for special education students at much lower cost? Why do impoverished 100% African-descended nations in the Caribbean have higher literacy rates than the United States? Why do other nations get their teachers from the top 5 to 30% of their class, while U.S. teachers on average come from the bottom third of the class? How does a nation with rampant grade inflation, social promotion, debased high school diplomas, and de facto open admission to colleges claim to have high standards? Why did Bill Gates establish a Microsoft research center in Beijing staffed by Chinese researchers while saying the most groundbreaking and innovative ideas were not focused in the United States anymore? How did these things happen? How did we lose our way? Serious mission confusion began when schools were declared the ideal forum to resolve explosive issues of class, language, race, religion, and sexuality that society was unwilling or unable to deal with elsewhere. Inevitably, the quality of the educational product began to sag under the weight of the social missions and attendant confusion of purpose. From this point, we would see a steady erosion of public confidence and also a decline in achievement. In more stable settings, it would be possible to paper over the cracks in the edifice, but in less stable settings, notably our large urban systems, it was impossible to mask the descent into educational chaos marked by student disorders, confrontations among parent groups, labor disputes, battles over finance, and litigation on just about everything. During the same period, there seemed to be an increasing doubt among educators as to what to teach and how. Requirements fell and core curriculum diminished. How do we put our schools back together again? We don't. The traditional educational system is gone forever, and we should admit it. The real solution lies not in more tinkering with the increasing contradictions of the existing system, but rather in a radicalized reform that would fundamentally redesign our education system along more rational lines. The result would be a curriculum consensus similar to those in the rest of the world, and schools pursuing reasonable missions at reasonable costs. It's not magic. Other countries do it. Why not the United States? Surely this can't be so easy, you say. You're right. Hear that mooing in the background? That's education's herd of sacred cows whose thinking on reform starts and ends with a dollar sign, and who would see our schools in ruin before sacrificing their vested interest on behalf of the national interest. As Pogo used to say, we have met the enemy, and it is us. Can we turn all of this around? The commentator Charles Krauthammer reminds us that decline is a choice. So too is Renaissance. Which door will America pass through? Winston Churchill famously said that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've tried every other thing. Well, educationally, we've tried every other thing. It's now time to do the right thing.
So many times we will get into a situation where we'll go to the well and try to change things, and we'll go there 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times and get turned away and think that, well, it's never going to change. And what I keep telling people, if you go to that same well 100 times and the answer is still no, if you don't go back the 101st time, they win. You've got to keep going back over and over and over and not let them win, let them know that you are not going away. And commenting on a couple of other comments that the other panelists made, I thought you would find this interesting in terms of, you know, money, not including the cost of construction. Anybody want to take a wild guess how much money has been spent by the state of New Jersey in just 30 school districts over the last 20 years? $20 billion on the average schools. 60% of the money goes to 22% of the students. And to follow up on the story about the letter A, I, at one time after I left teaching, was working for a company that was doing educational development materials. And I was called into, ironically, Jersey City State College for an audiovisual individualized type of remedial reading program. And I asked the instructor that I was speaking to, I said, well, I'm kind of curious as to why you would want to have this program. And I thought they were looking at it from a standpoint of new technology, how to present phonics or whatever reading technique there was. And I said, so why are you looking at this? And she said, well, it's for our students. And I said, well, yeah, I know it's for your students, but I mean, in terms of how you're going to use it in the classroom, what? He said, no, you don't understand. It's for our students. So what do you mean, person? So our students come into us reading at about a 4th grade level, and they want to be teachers. And I said, you're kidding me. And she said, there's only one thing worse. I said, what's that? We're graduating them.
Despite the gloomy overview, I'm actually more optimistic about education reform today than I've been in the last 30 years. And the reason is very simple. It is a matter of finance. And the fact is, we are very simply broke. And yet, people do not grasp, as some of the remarks here illuminate, the truth of what we are spending. The average state spends 47% of its general fund on K-12 education. The average local jurisdiction below state level spends on average 67% of its revenue on K-12 education. So that means nationwide, that is more than 3 out of every $5 is going to a single budgetary category. And I stress the need to think of education as an entitlement. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are in terrific shape compared to K-12 education. But only if you think of K-12 education as an entitlement can you get people to accept the fact that this thing just is not sustainable. I found an interesting new career of late being an expert witness on school education finance lawsuits. And the astounding thing is, you're in an impossible situation financially, and yet all across the country, the education establishment is going to court with the same song. We need more money. Do it for the kids. Judge, help us. You mentioned thorough and efficient. We just finished a trial in Colorado, a $5 billion lawsuit. There we call it thorough and uniform. And we lost that case. And the judge has created an impossible situation, and this is happening all across the country. So the Democratic governor, and most of the people I consult with now are Democrats because they're in more trouble, said, look, there is no money. We're not going to pay it. And this is causing a bipartisan consensus. It astounds me, the responsiveness. I get equal responsiveness from Democratic and Republican legislatures because, as I always love that line of Andrew Cuomo's, I'm a liberal who's broke. I need a new idea. So the new idea is a radically different kind of education. If the other 19 industrial nations in the world can do better education for much less cost, what in God's name is wrong with us? It is time to wake up and realize that a new day has to dawn or as Lucy used to say, we'll have a lot of splaining to do to our children and grandchildren.
I recently met with my union representative, and I told her that I was fed up with the ways of old, and I was demanding a coalition for the conservative teachers, of which there are many. There are many conservative teachers. They're just in the shadows. They're hiding, and they don't want to come out because they're afraid of the repercussions. The time is now, because our kids are failing. And when we're placing 28th among, industrialized nations in math, and we can't, top ever, the top 5, those days are gone, and we need to regain some sort of validity for our profession, and this is the way to do it, to tie in the performance-based initiative.
On that, the first thing you need are strong charter school laws, which means there has to be something in the state whereby you can have the possibility of getting chartered through your district, but it's usually better to go through a state chartering authority that is friendly to charter schools. So that's the first thing you would want. The second thing you would want is to be able to get out from under these laws when it comes to teacher hiring and things like that, which I've already mentioned. The certification issue is big. The third thing you want is real autonomy when it comes to curriculum and things like that. For example, there's usually in good states, in states like Arizona and Colorado, when you have a lot of latitude as far as what kind of charter school you want to set up, you can have all these waivers where you waive these ridiculous state requirements. But in states that don't have very favorable charter school laws, you can be required, even though you're a charter school, to do the state sex education program, for example, which is not what you want your kids going through. It's not abstinence-based, let's put it that way. And just tons and tons of requirements that even the charters can't get out from under. So those are the kind of things that a state needs to put in place so that it can actually be a charter-friendly school. If those regulations are not put in place, then the charter school just becomes slightly better than a regular public school. And this is something that I know former commissioner from Colorado would speak to, because in fact he told me in his office one time that one of the early union people in Wisconsin, or maybe it was Minnesota, who was against charter schools, basically gave a directive to all his workers under him that said, crush them if you can, co-opt them if you must. So there's a real danger in making sure that charter schools are truly choice, and not just a reproduced public school with a lot of money coming their way.
Wrong. The worst reform of the last half century, and this is counterintuitive, it's class size reduction. We have made a fetish of that, and it seems to make sense. In 1960, student-teacher ratio in this country was 27 to 1, pretty much the same as similar to other industrial nations. Today, it's about 15 to 1. The question is, what happened and why? Just ask yourself, what is the union perspective? Well, more teachers means more members. More members means more dues money. More dues money means more political clout. More political clout means more members, and so on. Right now, and I often quote my friend Chester Finn of the Fordham Foundation, America has about 1 million more teachers than we need. Now, that is costing us money that reaches up into the trillions over time. Those nations who are beating us overseas, they routinely have class sized twice what we have in the United States.
And will the growth rates at double digits continue?
Sure. Charters, from our standpoint, are a key element of education reform. One of the things you've got to understand about charter schools is that it gives a lot of control locally, which of course is what the design is. That's one of the fundamental principles of American public education since the founding. But it's a double-edged sword in that there are good charter schools and not so good charter schools. Most of this is a function of the ideas and the philosophy that's incorporated in how the schools are developed and designed. But the whole point is that it's the alternative to the failing public schools. So someone might say, well, they're just an experiment and half of them fail. Well, that's fine. We're going to, the whole process filters up those that do succeed, because virtually all of the public schools are failing, just like Dr. Moore said earlier. So a 50% success rate is better than a 0% success rate. So charter schools are a critical element of education reform in this country, and I think they need to continue to be promoted and supported in the states. They also provide the inroads to break up the forces that are working against education reform, such as things that are happening in the teachers' unions and in the colleges of education.
So basically, the Georgia Supreme Court in a 4-3 decision voted that the state chartered schools were unconstitutional, based on the essentially throwing 8,000 kids who were attending, some of them very high-performing charter schools, into a scenario where they would have to go back to the district schools, some of which were demonstrably failing. The local district in Atlanta started by suing her to stop the school from opening completely. Instead, when they won the suit and that didn't work, they got chartered by the state. Okay, so not the local district. The state had its own charter organization that chartered them. They opened for 3 years, 100% of their kids passing the state test. And then the Supreme Court decision came in Georgia. They invalidated the state chartering group, and it would have closed basically all these schools, but they got a 1-year reprieve through some sort of essentially the local district that had sued her agreed to take her on for a 1-year term. What just happened last week, brand new news, they're shutting her down completely. They basically, and you should have seen these schools. You look into the eyes of these kids. This is an extremely high-performing charter school, blowing away all the state standards. They simply are perceived as competition for the regular district schools. And you know what? If these guys go away, they get more money. And so they decided to revoke her charter. It's sickening.
This is in Atlanta.
It's in Atlanta.
Atlanta, which just recently, as of last year, was called for their cheating on their standardized tests. And let me tell you a little tidbit, a juicy tidbit. A lot of the times, the people at the top, as superintendents and their cohorts that work in these bureaucracies, these district offices, they start out, a lot of them start out in New York City. And they travel the country. But wouldn't you know that my former principal was superintendent of Newark, who happened to be the superintendent of Atlanta. No surprise. And when I told one of my colleagues this, she fell off the floor. I said, well, it's not a surprise that these are the same people, they're entrenched in the system, and it's really shameful that a school that is performing at such high standards meets that fate, but meanwhile, the cheating and the manipulating of data that goes on with some of these people at the helm really goes unpunished. And I think one of their guys tried to come into Newark last year and then got flagged.
And just a little background on the Atlanta cheating scandal, which was a separate news story. We covered that as well, interviewed the Governor Deal of Georgia. But essentially, normally you think about school cheating, it's about kids. In this case, it was teachers cheating. They had erasure parties, they called them, where they would come and change all the test grades to make the grades look better. This wasn't, and if you'd imagine maybe 2 or 3 or 9 or 11 teachers caught doing this, maybe it's sort of like coincidental or a few bad apples kind of thing. This is over 170 teachers in one school district who all admitted to cheating because it was so statistically verifiable in the context of these tests. And so that was its own story. We have them all around the country. But go ahead, Bill. I saw your hand first.
Just a word of background and say on charters. Charters get their foot in the door simply because the establishment is terrified of vouchers, and the movement is prospering. There's a footnote to the New Orleans story. You say, well, wait a minute, how did they get 70% of all schools becoming charter schools? Well, it took Hurricane Katrina to do that. But the state legislature, and this is stunning, one of the reasons they're succeeding, the state legislature nullified the collective bargaining agreement of all school employees, teachers, non-teaching employees. I mean, that is revolutionary, and only the shock of Katrina led even a conservative Southern legislature to do that. But what that tells you is that the key to the issue is all about politics. If you don't solve it politically, you're not going to solve it educationally. And interestingly, when you talk to foreigners, particularly in Europe, it is impossible to explain to them what a voucher is because they're routine over there. It's like, but Bill, America's democracy. Are you saying Americans can't choose their child's school? And Europeans learned out of about 300 years of religious wars that it is much better to just let people send their kids to the school, you know, that they believe in. So our opposition to vouchers is not only irrational on its face, it is atypical of the world.
I had a question before that I don't think we fully explored. This is National School Choice Week. As Dr. Moloney said, every industrialized country in the world has a voucher system. Every one except the United States.
Actually, I don't think that's
Just in some form of vouchers, you have choice. You just brought up a couple. In this discussion and a lot of discussions and panels on school choice, we devolve into solving technical issues, minor tweaks in the existing system. I know that's the system we have and we work within it, but I still wanted to know what among the board members, panel members here, what is their support or resistance to real choice? Now by real choice I mean you get your tax money and you take it anywhere you want to educate your child. And after the school year, the child passes a standardized test. To me, that's real choice. And I want to see what kind of support we have for that.
I'll just inject something. I don't know whether this is called support or not. Last year, when they were trying to pass the voucher program in New Jersey, they referred to it as the Opportunity Scholarship Act. I was called on to testify on behalf of the bill, except that Chris was taken aside and then came back with a message for me that when I testify, whatever I do, call it the Opportunity Scholarship Act. Do not call it vouchers, because if I do, the Democrats won't vote for it.
Don't use the V word.
Cannot use the V word.
Yeah.
We have a new word that we cannot use. We cannot use the V word.
Dick, I know you're a politician. You still haven't said whether you support vouchers or not.
Say that again?
Do you support vouchers and choice?
I testified in favor of it.
100%.
And I also am the original sponsor of New Jersey's Charter School Act.
So you believe that a citizen should be able to take their tax money, not send it to the public school system, and take it to whatever school they would like to send it to?
Absolutely. It's the student, it's the parent's choice. Who is better able to make a choice for their kids than their own parents?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm 100% for choice as well. And it goes back, in fact, I went to the University of Virginia, so I go back to the Jeffersonian principle, whereas education should be controlled locally, because he believed that the parents knew best how to educate their children. And that, I mean, so I'm 100% in favor of choice all the way.
Bill, I have a question for you about something about your prepared statement at the beginning, and I wrote this down as a note. It said, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that you advocate designing education along rational lines, including curriculum consensus. Is that true? Is that an accurate quote?
Yes, and the key to that is it's a simple act of imitation. This is done routinely in other nations. And I know we're very proud of our country, and the sons, oh, you copy foreigners? Yeah, if they've got a better system than we do, yeah, let's copy foreigners. But their system is so dramatically different than ours in its governance.
So I just
yes.
wanted to clarify that, but it's my sense that Terrence Common Core curriculum is a movement to create national standards for curricula across the country. It's my sense, Terrence, when you hear Bill say that you might be
a little nervous.
A little nervous might be an understatement.
Well, and here's the reason. I fully embrace the principle that you could come up with a very good national core, and not using state initiatives, but just doing it on his own. That's what E.D. Hirsch has been doing for the last 20 years, and he puts forth a solid curriculum. However, what happens when you start saying we need to have a national curriculum, a couple of things happen. Number one, the feds are going to have to get involved in some way. Now, the way that it was done recently, if you all saw this was a couple of years ago, when states adopted these voluntary national standards. And so it looked like it was being done at the state level. But as soon as that's done, then the feds step in and say, oh, we have these national standards, let's let us help you out with that. And I think that's a violation of local control of schools, which has gone on too long, since the Eisenhower administration and Sputnik.
And the potential downside of that is that part-produced violation of their autonomy. What is exactly the downside?
Well, because here's what's going to happen. These people are smart, okay? Progressive education is the right arm of the progressive movement. This is a political issue because the idea, well, notice for example that most well-to-do Democrat politicians do not send their kids to the public schools. They go to very ritzy private schools, and those kids are learning how to speak, and those kids are learning English in the proper ways. And it's true that their history classes are going to be kind of leftish, but nonetheless, they're getting a pretty good education.
What if you were satisfied if you looked over this set of curriculum?
Well, but I did look at the curriculum, and here's what goes on. First of all, it's like any of these other standards. You say you should read a very complex literary text in the 10th grade, such as, and they give you a list of books that you could read. What happens is they're going to start getting control of those such ases. And the schools, which just follow these things slavishly, will start looking at the books that are on the list, and increasingly that's going to become a more radical reading list. It's acceptable right now. So people like Chester Finn said, I looked at the standards, they look pretty good. I looked at the standards and I thought they were either weaker than the things that our school was already doing, or there were these winks towards, here's really what we want.
So to clarify, you're not seeing anything right now that screams out political orientation.
No,
you're concerned about future evolution.
No, there are a few things. There are a few things, and if you look at it closely,
what are those?
for example, some of the reading lists, it's very clear that they're not just trying to find the great American classics. They're trying to find a few great American classics, and you have to have a certain number of black women and possibly lesbian, gay, bisexual authors as well. That's already existing, and it's going to continue in that direction.
I see Rosa here.
We're doing it. We are involved in the process of setting, doing our Common Core learning standards. Edie Hirsch had it right, they do not. And this is what you need to be aware of. It's the quality, the access, the equality issue that is seeping into the Common Core curriculum. You're exactly correct, where they're trying to balance, yeah, some of that classic stuff that we need to learn, but make no mistake about it, there is an agenda. And I am just against a one-size-fits-all curriculum for any kid. Because again, if we are individuals, and you're going to tell me that the kid in Topeka is learning what the kid in Brooklyn is learning and needs to learn it at the same time, I'm having an issue with just that alone.
But in terms of these, what if the lists are just long enough that they could have all the left-wing stuff, but there's enough other stuff and like enough other choices that you could just do whatever you want? What about that?
Oh, Bob. We're talking about the government here involved at a level. And do you know what's going to happen? It's exactly correct. I think there's going to be tainting and persuasion on that will take hold of this Common Core curriculum, and we won't recognize it.
Okay, so Bill, you go ahead.
Yeah, we should not be divided on this. There is not a necessity for a national curriculum, and Terrence is absolutely correct to be suspicious of what's going on now in the national standards. If you just look who's putting that together, that's enough to frighten anyone. The key is the accountability, and the key to accountability is a test. People forget when No Child Left Behind first turned up in the U.S. Congress, it was written so that every state would have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, would be, let's say, the barometer. Now, if that had been done, you would have at least a common standard to measure. The 50 states could do whatever they pleased. No need for a national curriculum. However, and Terrence knows Bob Schaefer, who was in the Congress at that time, that was a political no-fly zone. No way you were going to get a national test for all of the political reasons. And so what they did was absolutely insane. They said, well, all right, every state can pick whatever test they like, and they can also define proficiency any way they like, and they also can set the cut score, meaning the passing score. And that was the end. The whole thing descended into a jumble of high cost. So you don't need a national curriculum, but what other nations have, not so much a national curriculum, but the test. Now, if you've got a good test, then a private school, a public school, the kind of school advocated so admirably at Hillsdale College, you should be able to do that, confident that your kids will probably do pretty well.
Well, I speak to the issue on the whole. First of all, there's a constitutional issue. There's nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that says anything about education. So if we were to want to have a Department of Education, we would have to retroactively pass a constitutional amendment. The second thing is there's an interesting history about how the feds get involved in education. And of course, it was always the conservatives who wanted to keep local control of schools, and it was always the left in Congress who wanted to get the federal government more involved in schools. And as I alluded to previously, the first major involvement of the federal government in education was under the Sputnik crisis, or perceived crisis, whereby the feds came in and promised to give a lot more money to local schools, and this was during the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower reluctantly signed the bill. Two things were supposed to happen. One, there was going to be much better science and math training. And we all know that, right? And the story that you're told in school, if you are told the story, is all of a sudden the schools got a lot of money and they did a lot better. Actually, math and science scores declined post-Sputnik, and there's a long, steady decline in math scores. The other thing that was supposed to happen is that we were going to teach foreign languages much better, because there are all these countries that were under potential communist influence. So I ask you, who are the people you know who went to high school in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who learned to speak fluent Russian, or learned to speak fluent Vietnamese, or learned to speak fluent Spanish or anything? They didn't. Language training in American schools is one of the worst in the world. So the achievement that was supposed to be the Sputnik education didn't happen. Now, President Carter elevated the Department of Education to a federal department with a cabinet head. Reagan ran on the campaign of dismantling the Department of Education. And the paradox, the irony of the whole thing is that in his first administration, what came out was the Nation at Risk report card. And it highlighted for the first time at a national level how bad public education was. Remember, it had that alluring beginning that said if a foreign nation had done this to us, we would consider it an act of war. As it is, we've done it to ourselves. But once education had that much of a national, that much national attention on it, there was no way then that you could back off and say, well, the feds aren't going to do anything. And I think, in fact, that the Tea Party movement and the mood of the country right now is really the first time in my lifetime where politics has really been rethinking the Constitution and rethinking what the 10th Amendment is, and rethinking what the responsibilities are for state legislatures and local governments. And so I think now is the time to push that, particularly after with what's going to happen in 2012. That should be a big agenda item in 2013. And I would further say that it's not just a question of getting the feds out of government, which would help a lot, but it's also local communities being informed once again about what a good education is. Those two things. For any kind of school reform to work, be it private schools or charter schools, I don't personally think we'll have the political clout for vouchers in a while, though I'm for them. Whatever that takes, it takes a lot of parental support, because the parents have to be the ones who are dissatisfied with what's going on in the school. But it also takes a lot of parental courage, because there's a good thing about public education. For 150 years in this country, we had some pretty good public education at the right kind of level with a minimal amount of public money going in that direction. And so we have an affinity for that. It goes back to the days of Jefferson. He wanted a solid public education. But now it's almost like a mania. So if you even suggest that you're going to take your kids to a different kind of school than the regular public school, or you even suggest that you're going to keep your kids home and homeschool them, you get these stares and these looks like, oh, you're one of those. And so that's why parental courage is so important, because what happens is before a community has a charter school or something like that, there are a lot of worried parents who are saying, you know, my kids aren't getting a very good education, but no one will take the first step. And as soon as a few parents come out of the darkness, so to speak, and try to start setting up a school, then a whole bunch of other parents join and say, you know, this is what we've been looking for. So I think that's a great question, and really parental courage is what's gonna lead this movement.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
I will provide. I describe that as the empire of the academy. And what you notice consistently is in every single state, there is a coordinated national campaign, and it's expressed in every state, to push education downward. We've got to have kindergarten, we've got to have preschool for everyone. Don't you know the French start everyone at the age of 3? And at the same time, the insanity reached unusual levels in Colorado, where our last governor, plus one, a nice man, but, had something that is, again, spreading nationally called P20. So it isn't enough that everyone has a high school education. It isn't enough that everyone goes to college, but graduate school may be necessary as well. And that was the panel, and my name was volunteered to be on it, and all the edgegrads get up and say, oh no, not him. The standards are debased. I mean, time was when you actually had to demonstrate some capacity to get out of high school. Now we've changed our standards for the high school diploma. They are identical to the standards for parole from prison. Time served and good behavior. You cannot avoid a diploma. That's exactly what it is. Hang around and be more or less non-disruptive, and you will get a diploma, ready or not. And
my general sense of mercy to the panel. We've been at this 2.5 hours already. Please thank our panelists for being here.
Yes.
We're going to continue the discussion outside.
When was the union allowed school? What year?
In the early 60s is when they started to change into a collective bargaining type union. But we'll continue the discussion outside. I just want to say, as bookkeeping points, I have cartel Blu-rays outside for sale. The high-definition version, which you probably want for your relatives and all your friends and neighbors. Also, we have $5 off just for this week. It expires. There's a code that expires in a week, but it's $5 off the store for all kinds of books. The Choice Media Store. There are all kinds of ed reform books and other movies, like Waiting for Superman and many others, and The Cartel, and a whole bunch of others, as well as, you know, T-shirts and all kinds of stuff. So those are outside too, the $5 off coupons. But again, my name is Bob Babbitt. Thanks for being here, and we'll all be outside.
If I may just share one other thing with you. It was something I mentioned before, and I finally found it. I was looking for it on the computer, and we were talking about how the courts are interfering with what's going on.
Well, why don't you tell people outside? I think they're...
Okay. That's fine. I found it.